Good evening, everybody, to the fourth debate of term, and a very busy house it is this evening. I'm very excited to say that we have a very topical debate this evening, given that it's less than a week to the US elections. The motion before us this evening is, this House welcomes the decline of America. Just a few House rules before we begin. There'll be 6 paper speakers this evening, a speech from the proposition, then opposition, followed by a round of floor speeches, in which you guys, the audience, get to take part, then another round of paper speakers, floor speeches, and the final round of paper speakers. You have the opportunity to make a point of information if you disagree with anything that one of our speakers says. Just raise your hand and say, point of information on that point, and you can challenge any of the speakers. They can accept your request or deny it. I'd also encourage that you keep this brief and relevant to the discussion, preferably under 20 seconds, and always do make sure that it is academically relevant. So, I'd like to introduce the first speaker to the House this evening, Professor Mary Kaldor. Professor Mary Kaldor is a Professor Emeritus of Global Governance and Director of the Conflict and Civicness Research Group at the London School of Economics. She's pioneered the concepts of new wars and global civil society. She was a founding member of European Nuclear Disarmament and the Helsinki Citizens Assembly. She's the author of many books and articles, including International Law and New Wars, with Christine Chinkin in 2017, and Global Security Cultures in 2018. You have the ears of the House.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. And as you say, it's 4 days to the US election, and we face a choice between an elderly, hugely unpredictable madman who is going to be in charge of a very powerful arsenal with thousands of nuclear weapons capable of blowing up the world several times over, and a sane person, actually somebody I rather admire, who is going to be hemmed in, if she wins, by all kinds of domestic pressures, the pro-Israel lobby, the fossil fuel interests, and the military-industrial complex. And so the reason I'm favouring this motion, the reason I welcome the decline of American power, is that I think no government should be in a position of this kind to decide the future of the world. It's just impossible. And when I say that, and when I say I welcome the decline of the United States, I don't mean that I welcome the rise of Russia and China. On the contrary, Russia and China are very dangerous autocracies who are huge threats both to their own people and to their neighbours. But my concern is this continued geopolitical military competition actually legitimizes Russia and China rather than thinks about how one could change those types of regimes. I know Professor Mearsheimer, who's going to speak in a minute, argues that the expansion of NATO was a cause of the war in Ukraine. I don't actually agree with him. I think the cause of the war in Ukraine has to do with the oligarchic, repressive nature of President Putin and his obsession with Russian ethno-nationalism. But it did provide a pretext. And that is my big concern, that actually this almost imaginary geopolitical military competition is mutually legitimizing. What I favor is a multilateralist system rather than a geopolitical system. And what I hope is that the rise of middle-level powers like South Africa or South Korea or regional organizations like the European Union or the African Union, and the increasing relevance of global public opinion is what can make that possible. So let me turn to the actual nature of American power. I'm not actually sure whether the United States is declining or not, because it's a matter of perception. And American power very much depends on our memory of the American role in World War II. And that's, in a way, what's being reproduced over and over again in our imagination in the geopolitical competition. But when American military power has actually been used, the results have been very different. It's incredibly difficult nowadays to win, or to do what the famous strategist Thomas Schelling called compellence. You can be incredibly destructive, but it's very hard to achieve political goals in the way that Clausewitz wanted great powers to do. So America has fought these wars in the last few decades. It's fought the wars in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. They did untold damage. Hundreds of thousands of people died. And they left those countries in a situation no better, perhaps worse, than they were before. And it's not just the wars. I mean, the war on terror, we've had the war on terror for 2 decades, and terrorism is far worse than it was in 2001. ISIS controls large parts of Africa. There are terrorist groups all over the Middle East and Europe. What?
Point of information.
What?
The goal of the war on terror to prevent any future attacks on the U.S. homeland. And since 2001, that has been effectively the case. In the past 2 decades, that's been the case in most of Europe, too. That it's drastically diminished any significant terrorism on America.
But the problem, if in terms of the proposition is, it may be fine if you're American, but what about the rest of us? That's why I welcome the... And I think, you know, it's not just that it hasn't worked. I just think it's normalized all kinds of things that shouldn't have been normalized. It's normalized targeted assassination. That was never something acceptable in the laws of war. What it does is it makes people like Hania or Nasrullah into martyrs when they should be treated as criminals and dealt with in courts. It's normalized the idea that you go after combatants where, what you call combatants, is there a difference? Are terrorists combatants or criminals? But let's say they're combatants. You go after them wherever they are.
Wasn't Anwar Sadat and also Gandhi also targeted for assassination?
Wasn't who?
Gandhi and Anwar Sadat were also assassinated long before this conflict with America.
Of course they were, but it was unacceptable. It was unacceptable to assassinate them. And most people thought this was unacceptable, and now it's become acceptable. It's okay to go and assassinate people now if you think they're a bad person. But who can decide whether they're a bad person? You need to judge them in a court. And, you know, the idea that you can kill combatants at home, outside a combat zone, because it's easier to find them when they're at home, or you can kill them in hospitals, and you can destroy the hospitals because there are terrorists there, which has increasingly become acceptable. These are really worrying developments as a consequence of the war on terror. And what is more, the language of the war on terror has been taken up by Russia and China. So Putin uses the language of the war on terror. He used it to justify what he was doing in Chechnya. He used it in Syria. China uses it in their war against the Uyghurs. So what?
Well, I just feel like making a bit too much out of the language used regarding the war on terror, but this kind of rhetoric can be seen all throughout the history of nations. I mean, Justinian going to war against the Persians in order to protect the Christian population. You can make these sorts of arguments without an American war on terror, so I don't see how this is uniquely American.
Well, I think that the war on terror represents a break with the American tradition. I mean, the Americans claim that they uphold international law. And that what they're doing, actually, is to redefine international law. And surely we're better than that. You know, surely we should be able to rise above these issues and try to make the world a little bit more rights-based and law-based than it was in the past. So, as well as military power, I think we should also be thinking about economic power. But before I say that, I just want to say one thing. When I say all this, it's not that I'm against military power. On the contrary, I think we need military power to deal with violations of international law. We need military power to deal with the crime of aggression. We need military power to deal with the crime of genocide. We need military power to deal with crimes against humanity. But if we're serious about international law, that military power has to be defensive and has to be aimed at protecting people and civilians. And that's where I think we need to go through a big change, because the old paradigm where military power was all about defeating enemies simply doesn't work. Okay, I've got 1 minute, just two things to say. One is economic power. The US, the dollar is the global international currency. The Federal Reserve is the lender of last resort. What that means is that America, unlike the rest of us, can borrow as much as it likes. And the effect of that is to suck resources from the rest of the world to the United States. Now, that doesn't mean I favour a BRICS currency, but I think what we need to go back to is a kind of democratic IMF, where the special drawing rights become a serious international currency. And that's the direction that we need to move in terms of economic power. Let me come to the end, and let me say that here we are in a really terrifying moment, with horror in Gaza and Lebanon, with the war continuing in Ukraine. Let me say that I would love it if whoever becomes president will continue to support Ukraine and indeed increase military assistance to Ukraine. Let me say that I would really hope that whoever becomes president uses their leverage to stop the war in the Middle East. But I think what's terrifying is that here we are, yes, I'm going to finish. Here we are, 2 days away, and everything, the whole future of the planet, not just war, but climate change, all of these things, probably depends on 10,000 votes in Wisconsin. So, you know, what we need is, and it's up to us who are not Americans, or who are Americans too, to try to think, to be responsible, and to try to press for a different kind of rights-based, law-based world. I mean, I think the ICJ decision that the South Africans brought, the ICJ case on genocide, the ICC decisions are hugely important. And what they've done is to expose the double standards on international law of the US and the UK. So it's up to the rest of us to push for a multilateralist, human rights-based world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now we head over to the first speaker for the opposition. We have the Right Honourable Lord Howard of Lympton. Michael Howard was the leader of the Conservative Party and leader of the opposition from 2003 to 2005. He previously held cabinet positions in the governments of Margaret Thatcher and John Major, including Home Secretary. He was Member of Parliament for Folkestone and Hythe from 1983 to 2010, when he was appointed a life peer. He was President of the Cambridge Union in Easter 1962. You have the ears of the House.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you for inviting me back. It's always a great pleasure to be back in Cambridge, and particularly here at the Union. And may I begin by congratulating Professor Kaldor on her speech. It was a most engaging attempt to put the best possible case forward for a hopeless motion. But I agree with her. on so many of the things that she said. I share her views on Donald Trump. I devoutly hope that Kamala Harris will be elected next Tuesday. It may all come down to 10,000 votes in Wisconsin, but that's democracy, and we favor democracy, don't we? I agree with her about the need for extra assistance to Ukraine. I agree that America has made mistakes in the past. Yes.
It's debatable whether it's democracy. The situation is under neoliberalism. We have a pay and conditions choice. We're not asked about human rights. We're not asked about the rule of law. Something you have a sort of trouble with in the past. And we're not asked about democracy, really. Without a system where these things are matter, we don't have democracy. All we have is a kind of opportunity to decide on who will give us the best pay and conditions.
We're asked for our views whenever we elect a new government. And if the issues which take place in the course of that election debate don't quite accord with your priorities, that's because you're not sufficiently effective in making those priorities the priorities of others. So I'm not going to... I'm not going to yield to any attacks on our system of democracy. Let me come to the motion. The motion is in two parts. First, it assumes that America is in decline. Secondly, it assumes that that decline is welcome. I shall deal with both assumptions. The assumption that America is in decline is false. America is not in decline. Not only does it remain by far the world's largest economy, pretty well every recent technological advance has been spearheaded in America. Artificial intelligence, space exploration, gene editing, electrified aircraft, the list goes on and on. It's all been spearheaded in America. Just allow me to make a little bit of progress. America has provided most of the military aid to Ukraine. Not enough, I agree, but most of it. Has created the AUKUS partnership with the United Kingdom and Australia. Has revitalized its relationship with Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. And crucially, is by far the biggest contributor of overseas development aid in the world. $63 billion in 2023. And if that's not enough, there's one statistic which demonstrates the wild inaccuracy of the premise on which the first part of the motion is based. In the year 2000, Mr. President, America and Europe had roughly the same share of the global economy. It was around 26%. Now, in view of the rise since then of China and other parts of the developing world, you would expect that share to have declined in the years that have passed since. And Europe's share has indeed declined to around 14%. America's share of the global economy is still 26%. So no decline. Yes, certainly I give way.
You spoke a lot about national effects and American places nationally. What would you say in terms of domestic decline, diminishing reproductive rights, increasing obesity rates, limited access to health care, and a general inaccessibility towards standards of living that are rapidly decreasing in America, but are more or less, they're changing across the world, but they're decreasing at a faster rate?
Those are measures on which I expect I would largely agree with the Honourable Lady, but they don't really represent decline. They represent differences of view within the United States, and it's a democracy. Now, as I've made plain, I don't always like the outcome of democracy, not only in the United States, but you have to accept, as I fear not every participant in American democracy has accepted, but in my book, you have to accept the outcome of democracy, and that's how those issues are decided. But let's turn to the second part of the motion. If there had been, or were to be, a decline, should we welcome it? If America were to decline, would it be welcomed by the people of Ukraine, who would undoubtedly receive less in military assistance than they do now? Would it be welcomed by the European members of NATO, who would face the prospect of Russian aggression with less help from America? Would it be welcomed by Taiwan, whose peaceful democracy is under daily threat from China? And would it be welcomed by the inhabitants of sub-Saharan Africa, who would get less than the $100 billion of AIDS relief, saving 25 million lives, which America is committed to providing over the next 20 years, who are currently facing an Mpox outbreak, but will receive 1 million doses of Mpox vaccine from America, and who have benefited so enormously from the success, largely financed by American aid, in defeating malaria. But of course, Mr. President, I entirely accept there are those who would welcome the decline of America were it ever to happen. It would doubtless be welcomed by Vladimir Putin, the man who invaded Ukraine and who, as we speak, is raining down drone attacks on the peace-loving civilians of that beleaguered country. It would be welcomed by Kim Jong-un, the ruler of North Korea, who only yesterday launched a rocket towards Japan. It would be welcomed by Xi Jinping, the president of China, whose human rights abuses in Xinjiang are so well documented. It would be welcomed by the supreme leader of Iran, who imposes a theocratic tyranny on his own people and is committed to the absolute destruction of the state of Israel. And dare I say, it should not be welcomed by everyone in this House this evening who might not be here free to debate had it not been for American intervention in the Second World War. All those, I just want to finish, I'm about to finish my speech. All those who would welcome the decline of America are the people I've just identified, and there are more. Is that the company, Mr. President, this House would wish to keep? I shall conclude with a famous telephone conversation which took place in 1966. That was the year in which President de Gaulle decided to withdraw France from NATO. And he telephoned President Lyndon Johnson to tell him of his decision. Mr. President, he said, France is leaving NATO, and I want all American service personnel to leave France. And President Johnson replied, are you going to dig up their graves?
Thank you very much for that speech. Now we turn to a round of floor speeches from you guys, the audience. Just a point of order or point of interest. For you guys, the floor speech prize this evening is a free cake from Fitzbilly's, which, for those of you that are new to Cambridge, is one of the best cake shops in town. So I call first for a speaker in proposition of the motion. Okay, no, he looked like he wanted. Okay, proposition of the motion. Please say your name and college. Thank you. There's a microphone just behind you as well.
Okay. Thank you. Lorenzo, Government Keys College. So we've heard from the Honourable Speaker which people should not welcome the decline of America, and those you said are the Ayatollahs of Iran, Putin, Kim Jong-un, etc. My question is, why would the Palestinians of Gaza not welcome the decline of America? They would. Why would Cubans not welcome the decline of America? Why would all the victims of American imperialism throughout the past few decades not welcome the decline of America? America, since 1945, before that too, but since 1945, has been involved in countless attempts to overthrow regimes. Most countries, or several countries in the world, have been subject to either a plan, an attempt, or a successful attempt to overthrow the regimes, often democratically elected. If we think about South America, the democratically elected regime of Allende was overthrown, and a fascist dictatorship was put in its place. that happened throughout South America with hundreds of thousands of deaths as a result of Operation Condor. Similar things have happened in North Africa. We know what happened in 2011 and those years with the support of this country and of France. It's happening now. It's not a regime change, but a massacre is happening now in Gaza. So my question is, why should all oppressed people not welcome the decline of America? And let me be very clear. I don't think they would welcome... yes, Sammy.
Do you think the other contenders for power, such as Russia and China, are necessarily better for this global system?
Absolutely not. It's what I was just about to say. I don't think that Russia or China would be better. And I would never want to live in a world where Russia or China has the same degree of unchecked power that America has now. But I think right now they are nowhere as big of a threat because they are much less powerful, and the possible, what may happen in the next few years will be a multipolar world order. Yes?
Do you think the civilians of Ukraine would agree that Russia is not that much of a threat?
No, I think it depends. I think the civilians of Crimea might think so, and civilians of Kiev certainly won't think so. But what I'm not saying that right now Russia is not a threat for anyone. I'm saying that at the world level, the threat that Russia poses is nowhere close to the one that the US poses. Sure. Okay, this is turning to paper speech.
You've spoken about Russia, but the thing is China actually, in some metrics, they're actually surpassing the US. So,
Sorry, can you speak up? Sorry.
yes, so, you brought up Russia, but China is actually on closing the distance quite quickly in terms of the wealth disparities with the US. On top of that, they have enormous regional influence, and it's an amount that's actually growing. And it's important to point this out because as America steps back, China is stepping forward. So with that in mind, does it really matter if you're not happy with America's power being replaced with China's, if that's what you're going to get at anyway? Because it's a choice between America as the policeman or China and Russia.
Well, first of all, I don't think China has ever expressed a desire to be the world policeman. Differently, I don't think China has ever expressed a desire to be the world's policeman. I've been understandably asked to conclude. So I'll just conclude by saying, I think that the decline of America may represent a once-in-a-century opportunity for the emergence of a multipolar world order where some principles of international law and of international humanitarian law, which have been constantly disregarded over the past 70 years, especially from America, not only, but especially from America, in an unchecked way, may come back to rule on the world.
Okay, now moving over to a speech in opposition. I think I'll pick the gentleman at the back there. Name and college, please.
Jonathan Marrow, Clare College. As an American, I have to ask a simple question, and it was already alluded to those of you who are in the emergency debate. What decline? Actually, what decline? I'm seriously asking. I'd love to be pointed out to me, and this was already made comment. The first proposition speaker said that the entire, the fate of the world depends on 10,000 voters in Wisconsin. Think about that power. 10,000 voters in Wisconsin, we decide the world. Just to know those 10,000 voters who are still undecided about Kamala and Trump after all these years, they're really smart, thoughtful people. Military. No, we spend more on our military than the next 9 countries combined, $800 billion a year. You guys in Britain are talking about a $22 billion black hole in the budget. That is laughable to us. We spend more on like one plane in our Air Force. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be mean, but economically, how many of you have a phone in your pockets? If you want to take it out, keep it silent. How many of you it's an iPhone? Shut up. I'm sorry, we invented AI look at technological startups. Look at a graph of technological startups in America versus Europe. America's here, Europe, the entirety of Europe is here. Economically, no thank you. Economically, diplomatically, what have you. Ukraine, you guys talk about Ukraine, half our country doesn't even know where Ukraine is on a map. Another half of it doesn't want to support it, they hate it, Trump, and yet we still do 10 times the number of the next support for Ukraine. And by the way, I'm not saying that America has always been great in the world. although it's close. I mean, we've almost invaded almost as many countries as the British Empire did, but not quite as many coups. I will give you this. And there's places where I don't approve of American intervention. Right now, Israel has been raised. I think it's important that it be raised. We are the United States, and I say this as a liberal Zionist who believes in the idea of Israel, but is disgusted by the Netanyahu government, disgusted by decades of Israeli intransigence, of the murderous rampage in Gaza right now. But here's the issue. America is supporting that, and is complicit in that. I do believe that. Why? Because America wants to be. America is so powerful, it is single-handedly preventing Netanyahu, who has been indicted by the International Criminal Court, who is a pariah in Europe, who probably, if he got off a plane in France or in Portugal, would be arrested. And America, using its single diplomatic power, is allowing that to happen. I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying maybe the decline would be welcomed. But decline? What decline? This is the country, and it has done good things. This is the country that put a man on the moon, that split the atom, that conquered the West, that defeated the Nazis, that defeated Wilhelmine Germany, that remade the world order. This is the country, and I'm very proud to wear that. I think it's pretty good that we're wearing a poppy, to think of our accomplishments together, that people in this country would say decline, decline. We can see an example of decline. Look outside the windows here. This is decline. But America, I don't think so. If we decline, it will be our choice and our choice only. Red, white, and blue, these colors don't bleed.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now, finally, a speech in abstention of the motion. To the gentleman over there. Name and college, please. A microphone will just be coming to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you for your raving comment. So I'm speaking abstention, which means I'll have something to say on the opposition side and something to say on the proposition side. My name is Parley Yang, doing PhD in mathematics from Clare College. So I have 2 points to make, essentially. 1 point against the proposition and 1 point against opposition. So the first point against proposition is on the member proposition's, I suppose, dream, let's say, that once America declines, there will be somewhat a balanced global power or something like that. And I think that's impossible looking at the human history. I mean, we always have one dominating power. 500 years ago was Netherlands, and then it was Great Britain, and then it's US. Go on. I don't agree with that. Actually, as that gentleman just pointed out, 1945 to 1981, Soviet Union was a very good competitor, but they're not there. It was US. Up until today, US still dominate power. But the point being that if US declines, I think it's a pure imagination. It is somewhat a fantasy to think that we will somehow have a balanced global power. There will be one particular strength that comes to domination. Let it be Russia, let it be China. It would just be terrifying. Go on. Well, but if you're abstaining, you shouldn't POI me, right? Right? If you, I mean, come on.
Began with the death of President Roosevelt in the Second World War.
Uh-huh.
After that point, the United States used nuclear weapons, showed the world that it couldn't restrain itself.
Uh-huh.
On every opportunity since then, it's taken its national interest, being the world's major superpower, taken an opportunist stance to enhance its own power.
But so sorry, can you mention your question? Like, POI is a question. Like,
No back and
Mr.
forth.
Chairman, like, POI is a question.
He's chose to deflect
Yeah,
your motion,
yeah.
so please
Well,
sit down.
Given up on democracy, given up on human rights.
He's told you to
Well,
sit
they
down,
can give
sir.
up. They can give up anything they like, but then,
Sir, please sit down.
yeah,
Thank
I mean,
you.
maybe he deserves a floor speech later on. But back to my point. So I think my reservation against the proposition is that the imagination that the decline of US will bring up a more balanced global power scheme, I think that's that's pure lunatic thinking. And that's a very wishful one, but it's lunatic. I think in the later section of today's debate, I would love the proposition to give more, let me say, logical hypothesis towards what will happen if US declines. I look forward to it. Now, on the opposition side, absolutely appreciate what that gentleman said. But look, one thing I would like to point out, and again to Lord Howard as well, is that in terms of the technology, it's actually not so much the case that US is currently the dominating power. And I would like to emphasize that because I'm actually doing a more technological course. Is that 1 minute? Okay, please conclude. Okay, I'll just point out a few items, but essentially artificial intelligence, it has been developed jointly with the global community. United Kingdom has a big role in it. Someone pointed out OpenAI, I want to point it out again, and many aspects. And I think it does show somehow the current decline of US dominance, and it's something to worry about. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the round of floor speeches. Now we move back to the paper speakers. The second speaker for the proposition is Tilly Middlehurst. Tilly is a second-year student studying HSBS at Fitzwilliam College and won the right to speak through audition. You have the ears of the House.
Sorry. Thank you for having me. In the spirit of Halloween, I'd like to invoke the scariest name of all. Ronald Reagan famously declared... Ronald Reagan famously declared that the most fear-inducing words are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." I'd one-up him on that, and I'd say, "I'm from the American government and I'm here to help," strikes me with far greater terror. So today I'll justify my belief that we ought to understand the decline of the United States as a necessary process in which the US makes space for other actors to assert influence. As the sun sets on unipolarity, I assert a few things in defense of my understanding that this is a net positive. Primarily, I claim that by the time we have to truly worry about a new balance of power, we will no longer live in a world where the decline of one will necessarily lead to the ascension of an unchecked communist threat, right? Secondly, I assert the truth. Authoritarian states are outnumbered and outmanned by democracies. If the opposition is right, and on this point I believe they are, that the world over is deeply concerned regarding the outcome of a less powerful United States, a coalition of interests will generate an appropriate response to potential foul play from countries with the ambition to step into America's spotlight. Finally, I note that one cannot lament the decline of an America that exists in the imagination of Americans only, and those individuals who ascribe to a number of myths. If we're to regret or oppose America's decline, we must come to terms with the reality that there has never been a United States champion of human rights and democracy in coexistence with United States global hegemonic superpower. But even if you don't think any of this is true, I ask you whether you prefer a world with checks and balances on something powerful over one without. One in which a nation, likely not your own, determines your fate or something else does. And yes, no thank you, I'll be taking on the hefty burden of defending the legitimacy of global and effective accountability mechanisms. And I'll do so because people instinctively oppose any form of gigantism. They think the bigger the network of individuals, the larger the regulations imposed, the less protections they ultimately gain. I aim to prove today that in cases such as this one, reality plays out in the exact opposite direction. An unaccountable state is a bad state. The US is not unique in its self-interest. I don't seek to demonize it. I operate politically as a left-wing individual who is sometimes accused of spoiled brat anti-Westernism, other times defamed as a neo-colonialist. What I accept is that good values and good ideas sometimes come from the West, and we ought to preserve those values. What I lament is the idea that the staunchly pro-American camp are here to defend them, or that their characterization of a world without American global hegemony is a world with Chinese dominance. With that being said, I'll start with my first and most important claim, that this debate is not about whether or not evil China, or maybe even evil Russia, is going to take America's spot and then do worse things than the United States would do. Why is this? Well, firstly, because the Cold War was a cause of enlarged diplomatic institutions that arose as guardrails to protect the ideological victory of the US. It's implausible, then, to suggest that history merely echoes in the background as the United States loses its global standing. Good collaboration, good institutions, and particularly good ideas, which are what I'm most interested in, are here to stay. I must challenge the extent to which America and the West are responsible for the dissemination of good Western values, but for now I'll deal with the all-too-important reality of what comes next following this decline. To do this, I must address the non-existent clash at the heart of this debate tonight, right? That America is on the decline at all, that we're dealing with the motion happening in the present. I therefore would agree with our last opposition speaker on this aspect, and the impassioned floor speaker who, as an American, informed us of how powerful the US is, and it's the truth. The US conquered the world with the dollar. Nearly all 195 countries are dependent on it in some way. Chinese currency only makes up 2.5% of world reserves. The euro is at 21.2. The SWIFT international payment network, owned in large part by the US, who has major skin in the game here, is the main avenue for the processing of almost every single electronic payment in world trade. Militarily, the US has the most powerful weapons, the most inflated military budget, and more bases around the world than anyone else. As Biden, before his lobotomy, roused, America never bows, it never bends, it never breaks. We're America second to none. We own the finish line. Similarly, simultaneously, the unipolar order is indeed coming to an end. This is sophisticated Aristotelian philosophy, which states that two things can exist at once, right? It's not because America is floundering internationally, despite its deeply disturbing problems and occurrence domestically. The threat of a nationwide ban on women's right to choose, the election of a potential insurrectionist held liable in court for sexual abuse. Unipolarity is ending because other states are gaining momentum, not because America is in the near future going bust, right? So what does the composition of global power look like then? Well, if we examine the regional composition of the global top 10%, we find the share of top 10% income holders coming from particularly East Asia has increased steadily since 1950, and that's North American dominance within the global top 10%. It's still stark. If we're to measure the power of states through a Marxist prognosis, if we're looking at which individuals compose the very wealthy, we find the same general pattern for the regional composition of the global top 1%. Relations between what in international studies we describe as the center with the periphery demonstrate that state powers who are dominating economically will organize the international division of labor in a way that best suits their interest, whereas periphery states, especially those as mentioned by opposition in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, are relegated to less productive activities which require less equipment, less human capital. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is that the persistence of a US-led global hierarchy in the present remains even as power dynamics begin the process of diversification. Why am I making the point that the decline of America is definitely not happening yet if it's already been made? Well, I'm doing so because it sets the groundwork for my premise here that by the time a potential new replacement to the United States demands our attention, we'll no longer operate within a system characterized by one power's decline, triggering the unchecked rise of another, especially not an autocratic one. Reliance on trade is important, and the more globally and therefore multipolar the world looks, the more this will happen, which is a good thing for obvious reasons, right? You don't want any one state to monopolize an industry entirely. But I say even if China does become isolationist, which realistically, China's the only country that is also a global power contender, which might attempt it, the country's going to crumble due to the crises it's already suffering from demographically and geographically. See how I'm not predicting a world of harmony here, but rather a fiercely competitive one, where states operate under the principle that unchecked actions have consequences, and that would include North America. The norms that emerge in this world are not moral imperatives, they're practical necessities. I believe this is possible, not only because the data I just presented in regard to countries catching up to the West deems it inevitable, but also because the dynamics of the Cold War altered international politics forever, insofar as it's a product of identities locked in enmity that had formed through hostile interactions and were ultimately changed. In fact, Mearsheimer himself predicted that once the Soviet Union dissolved, NATO would follow suit. By 1989, after 4 decades of interactions, member states' relationally contingent identities had changed, obviously, and NATO continues to shift its goalposts dependent upon whatever contemporary issues the international community faces today. So I think this ought to teach us a lesson about what it means for states to operate on the basis of collective interest. The illusion that US hegemony brings peace, whereas multipolarity does not, is one I seek to disprove. I seek to dispel this myth through my second claim, which is that the characterization of America so often invoked is smoke and mirrors. It's asserting the existence of an ideal type, proclaiming the purpose of the United States is to do what it's consistently failed to do. As such, though I accept it's entirely possible that the country could fulfill the role of defender of democracy and freedom now, I don't see any evidence that it plans to. So I, rather radically, base my understanding of what America is and its values look like on recent history and what it's doing in the present. In fact, I think it's necessary that the United States does decline, such that it can, if it so chooses, act as the opposition characterizes in the future, i.e. a force for good, part of a coalition of state interests. The US hasn't maintained its status as the most powerful country by being the most moral or ethical, but because it's the most ruthless cutthroat machine. This is why, when I hear about the uniquely American values of democracy and freedom, I wonder what specifically the US has to offer in that regard. The US granted women's suffrage after New Zealand, Australia, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and Russia, abolished slavery only after 8 other countries did the same. The Global Peace Index ranks China 40 places higher than America. I'll take the point, though. Yes? Yes?
The reason we're sitting here tonight is that US influence, as flawed as it was necessary to get Europe out of the situations of the First and the Second World War.
I think it is deeply disingenuous to claim that the period of multipolarity we had in Europe at that time didn't lead to anything other than totally brutal conflict and the near swallowing of Europe by totalitarianism, fascism, and communism.
That's why I'm making a future projection. It's exactly why I make a future projection. I don't focus on the past of multipolarity because it was based on European balance of power politics, which is obviously very different to what's going to come in the future, insofar as like better global accountability mechanisms happen on account of the fact that the Cold War has happened, right? So I already characterized that because of the Cold War, these identities locked in enmity have changed, and therefore the World War stuff is less relevant, right? So just to conclude then, I think that like it's Milton Friedman expresses the US foreign policy approach nicely when he contends that profit-making is democracy, that any government pursuing anti-market policies is therefore anti-democratic, that it's the job of the United States to overthrow democratically elected governments in the interests of stability. It's why the Allende government in Chile, which enjoyed significant popular support, was overthrown with vigor. It's why Colombia's domestic wheat industry was decimated, leading to nationwide drug problems. It's why Bolivian water was privatized, a coup incited by the CIA in Guatemala. It's why the Venezuelan government and oil firms were blocked from accessing international credit markets. It's why authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt are supported for their role in maintaining stability. It's why the US protected time. It's why the US has a uniquely terrifying relationship with Israel, whereby the ethno-state can commit atrocities with unconditional support, because a stable Israel is a buffer of Western influence in the Middle East, a buffer that secures oil flows essential for the American economic interest, because America never bows, it never bends, it never breaks, it owns the finish line. Don't fear multipolarity, fear the only state that can't be contained, and it's not the East. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now we move over to the second speaker for the opposition, Shashank Joshi. Shashank is a defense editor at The Economist and a visiting senior research fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Guys, please, quiet, thank you. Prior to joining The Economist in 2018, he served as senior research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, where he now serves on the advisory board, and research associate at Oxford University Changing Character of War programme. You have the ears of the House.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be back. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for some excellent interventions so far. I think it's very important for us, first of all, to just reflect and look at the world as it is and not as we wish it to be. I've just heard a lot about global accountability mechanisms, and my first response is to ask, are these global accountability mechanisms in the room with us now? Because I see we've just emerged from a week in which, and if Tom Clancy had told us this 3 or 4 years ago, we would have thought this was slightly half-baked and jumping the shark. 18,000 North Korean troops have just turned up in Russia, ready to join an existential war of conquest imposed by Russia on its neighbour. That's the world we are living in right now. And that's the kind of multipolarity that I see unfolding in front of us today. I think when we hear the word multipolarity, it's come up a few times today, we think of something quite benign and something quite promising. We think of the global south having its fair share in the international system, having its voice. Middle powers like South Korea, Indonesia, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa rising up, having their stake in global institutions, and a more equitable balance of power, a more just order. That is one version of multipolarity. It's not the version of multipolarity I see emerging. What I see is something akin to the more competitive, visceral, vicious, potentially cataclysmic sort of multipolarity we heard from the gentleman over there just a few moments ago. And I think the place to begin here is Ukraine. We must take this conversation back to Ukraine. I found myself agreeing vigorously with so much of what Professor Kaldor said, particularly on her support for aid to Ukraine. But I cannot see how in the same breath we can hope that the US, the United States, maintains, even grows, as I think she commendably said, its support for Ukraine, but also welcome and cheer on its decline. I've spent 2.5 years covering Ukraine as a journalist, visiting, talking to people, seeing this up close. And we've heard a lot about balancing coalitions taking shape in the international system. Where are these? What I see is that in February 2022, when Russia invaded its neighbor, ready to snuff out democracy in Ukraine, ready to replicate across the country what we saw in Kherson in the south, torture camps, the abduction and deportation of children, it was not us as Europeans that stood up blocking that attempt with weapons, with aid, with intelligence. We were slow, we were divided, we were feckless. When the war came, what did Germany, Europe's largest economy, offer to the Ukrainians? 500 helmets. That, I think, demeans us. It was America that stepped up, indeed that has stepped up before the war, providing lethal aid to the Ukrainians. Nothing to be ashamed of. The means that Ukrainians had, through artillery, through missiles, through bullets, through shells, words that I think we shouldn't shy away from, to parry and repel Russia's aggression successfully. It wasn't us as Europeans, and it still isn't us as Europeans. Just now, we've seen North Korea provide 2.9 million shells to Russia. Do you know how many shells that the Europeans make collectively, that we as a continent produce? At the beginning of this year, we congratulated ourselves, pat ourselves on the back, and celebrated that we reached 1 million. And here is North Korea, a tin pot dictatorship, providing months' worth of firepower to the Russian army in Europe. And who is it that stands between them and subjugation? It was the Americans, it's the United States, and it continues to be. And let me tell you very, very clearly, without American aid, without American missiles, weapons, intelligence, support, Ukraine would fall, and it may yet fall. This debate is not about Donald Trump. We would find very few of us in this room, I think, who would cheer his arrival next week. American democracy has been through much worse. Its institutions are resilient. Mr. Trump, if he is elected, will survive in office for 4 years. He will be gone, and America will renew itself as it has done so many other times in the future. But there is no alternative provider, no alternative pole in the international system that will save Ukraine from this Russian onslaught. This isn't just a Ukrainian story. This isn't just a European story. I look thousands of miles to the east, to Taiwan, a small, vibrant, prosperous democracy, one that produces some of the world's most advanced technology, the chips that are in our phones, in our computers, that are vital to the functioning of the world economy, that has stood on the edge of the Chinese Communist Party's ambitions to subjugate it, just as Russia has sought to subjugate Ukraine. Where are the balancing coalitions that we heard about that will save Taiwan? They're not coming from Japan or India or Indonesia or Australia. Those countries will all play a role, recognizing the fact that America is no longer as unchallenged as it was, and that its allies will have to step up to share the burden. But they cannot do it without America. And so, to cheer on American decline in service of some chimerical objective of more just international order, I think is to forget and to perhaps miss that without America's military might, without America's power, Taiwan would go the same way. And an island democracy that is a successful Chinese democracy in Asia that has never been ruled by the Chinese Communist Party would fall victim to the same predations and losses and destruction that we see in Europe. That is America. I'll take it, please.
You're describing how the richest country in the world is able to do the most internationally. Why is America the best actor on an objective and not an economic basis, and not Iceland, which ranks higher on the Global Peace Index, or Finland with the happiest population?
Iceland and Finland are wonderful countries. Iceland is a member of NATO, a plucky little member. It doesn't have much by way of military forces, but it does play a vital role in the alliance. Finland is one of Europe's most happy, but also the most resilient and prepared societies. But even Finland, which has, by the way, the largest artillery force in Europe, which you may not know, was not able to stand in the path of the Russian army when it came. And indeed, Finland, when the Russian army came, was forced to sign a lopsided treaty in the Winter War of 1939 to 1940. So those countries, while commendable on any number of counts, no more morally inferior to the United States, simply don't have the clout and the power and the military strength that is required in the world to stand up to an increasingly solid, deep axis of autocracies that my honourable friend mentioned earlier on, a world in which China is the critical enabler of Russia's defence industry, providing the essential inputs for Russia to make the tanks and missiles that it uses in Ukraine. I'll come to you in just a moment, please. In which Iran is providing ballistic missiles and shells, in which North Korea is providing troops and missiles, in a world in which those adversaries form a deep and growing coalition to challenge the world order, specifically to snuff out their liberal democratic adversaries, it is still, I'm sorry to say, and as much as we may wish it were otherwise, only America that has the wherewithal to resist it. I'll take that point now. Thank you. Point taken. I regret to say I disagree with my esteemed colleague on that point and with you on that as well. And I'm afraid that those who would say that NATO provoked this invasion by moving closer to Ukraine would also have us live in a world in which small, flourishing, prosperous democracies of Eastern Europe today, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, countries that were once in the USSR and the Warsaw Pact, would today be without the protection, without the choice to cast their own path forward that has enabled them to grow into the successful European democracies they are today. So I don't share that view. Sorry, I'll finish, please. On my final... What I'd like to conclude by saying is that a world in which America is declining, is unable to provide that support, and we aren't very far off if we look at the turmoil in Congress that nearly cut off aid to Ukraine, the turmoil in the presidency that may yet again cut it off in a week's time. That world is not just violent, unstable, disruptive, disordered. It is also one in which America's allies who depend on it, denied the certainty and the confidence of their protection, the protection that was extended over us, over France, over us as Europeans. They will seek alternative means to secure their futures and their survival. And what that means is a world in which South Korea, Japan, Saudi Arabia, other allies around the world will seek nuclear weapons of their own to guarantee their survival, because they have seen in Ukraine the powerful deterrent umbrella that nuclear weapons provide. And a world in which America no longer has the strength or wherewithal to support those alliances, in which its allies are cast asunder, in which they are adrift, it will be one in which we see nuclear pursuit around the world, arguments that Professor Mearsheimer made many years ago. That is a world that I submit to you is extremely dangerous, one in which we should be deeply concerned, and one which I think we should treat as a grave danger to all of us today. So I thank you for listening, and I commend you to vote against this motion. Thank you.
Thank you for the round of paper speeches. Now we turn back to a round of floor speeches. So, would anybody like to speak in proposition of the motion? Proposition. Anybody up top? Proposition. Proposition of the motion. Nobody would like to speak in proposition. Anyone? You can win a free cake if you're any good. Oh, what's it? At the top. Yes, at the top there. Can we get a microphone? You might have to wait just a few seconds. If we could get a microphone up there, that would be brilliant. Thank you. Name and college as well, please. So it would just be 2 seconds.
Finley Walsh from Gonville and Keys. So I recognise that the debate thus far has been primarily focused on America's military preeminence, but I would like to talk about the more neglected economic side of this debate in terms of why this House would welcome the decline of America. And I want to talk about the current global systems that we see under capitalism, where, yes, we may see success in Western liberal democracies and America may be thriving. However, that is because it has exported its exploitation to nations around the world, third world developing countries. We see that many products made for American consumption are instead produced in sweatshops where there are lower labor laws and less regulations, where where workers are denied adequate rights, where they are not paid for their work, yet people, citizens of America and the Western world benefit from this exploitation whilst themselves succeeding. I think that the proposition perhaps hasn't established this well enough, but I would like to see them take this further. Yes?
Is that why the share of people in global poverty has gone down from roughly 60% in 1950 to around 5% today? Is the evil nature of the US doing that as well?
I would actually say that's due to how we define poverty. I will actually sort of cite Richard Wolff. If any of you are interested in a better answer to this question than one I will give, he gives a good explanation of why the way we define the global poverty level is essentially inaccurate, and it doesn't actually express any of what it means to live a good, stable, healthy life, and the cutoff line of poverty is actually entirely arbitrary. And I will cite another economist who knows his stuff much better than mine. Yes? Where?
It's very easy for you in a small room in this country to say that poverty is completely arbitrary, but actually the difference between also being a village and not being a village is absolutely life-changing. Things like things we discussed outside Africa or the Western world, and that is down to the American there to live with the border for the past 50 years.
Sorry, I think my point was that the definition we have for poverty and the global poverty line is tied to the American dollar, and it is simply an arbitrarily chosen amount. So my point was more so that when we talk about global poverty having decreased, it doesn't actually reflect any of those important issues that you talk about, having access to, clean water or healthy food. So, but yes, as I was saying, or bringing back to the point of economic preeminence, I believe, yes, the opposition has made some compelling points about America's military might. However, they have neglected to consider America's economic preeminence, which locks third world countries and developing countries into subservient positions. No, thank you, sorry. Selling resources to America, which eventually benefits ultimately. And when these third world countries do not see adequate recompense for their work and their labor. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. Now, somebody to speak in opposition of the motion. We'll go down here. Name and college, please.
Hi, my name is Rajuda Pandit, and I'm from Selwyn College. I feel a little bit bad for the proposition in this debate, not because I don't think the points that have been spoken are correct in a vacuum, but because this resolution doesn't exist in a vacuum. I think a resolution that in a vacuum said, this House welcomes the decline of America in a utopian future, their points exist and they're valid, but this resolution exists in the status quo. As we see it right now, we've already made a number of points about foreign policy, so I'll turn it more domestic. Someone over there recently brought up the number of issues that we've seen in American democracy, the backsliding on democracy in general, the downturn of reproductive rights. Those are all true. I'm a female voter from America. I cast my ballot early. I know that this is a difficult election, and I've experienced this for as long as I've been able to vote. But I will also say that there is a version of America that exists in the minds of millions upon millions upon millions of people that should be voted for and that should be preserved and that shouldn't be in decline. I'll start out with a story from one of my friends who I consider to be British. I think she's British because she was born in London. To her, she's German, not British. She is a German who lives in Britain. When I was born outside of Chicago, I was born to Indian immigrants. They had visas when I was born, but I was a citizen because I was born in America. I've never once in my life thought of myself as an Indian living in America. I've always thought of myself as an Indian citizen, as an American citizen, not as an Indian subject. That is a major difference between America and other international powers. This ability to bring in people together, to cast ballots, to express disagreement. I disagree with every Trump voter in the nation, but the fact that they have the right to disagree is something that doesn't exist in any of the alternatives to American power right now. You brought up that China ranks higher than the United States on the World Peace Index. I would argue that's because in China, if you dissent, you'll get thrown into jail for God untold amounts of time. No, not right now, but I would say that if you look at journalism in America, yes, it's on decline. There's an issue when it comes to freedom of press. We saw that with the Washington Post. Yet people are still able to fight against that. That's a vision of America that we should vote to protect. America is not in decline. No statistics show it. The statistics on which other nations are ahead of the country are completely arbitrary, or they're decided on a metric which has no global standing whatsoever. So if we agree that America is not currently in decline, there is a vision for America which we should not vote should be in decline in a utopian future. I'll rest my case there.
Thank you for the speech. Now, would anybody like to speak in abstention of the motion? We'll go to anybody? No, okay, we'll go down here. Name and college, please.
Hi, my name is Oscar Devenger. I'm from Corpus Christi College, and I am an English literature student, and you'll be able to tell with what I'm about to say, because I want to dig into the wording of this motion. It's particularly welcome and decline. I'll start with decline, because decline suggests that it's a gradual thing, and what if it's going to be a fall? I think that's an important question, because in 5 days, we might have the fall of America, potentially. So maybe it's not a decline, maybe it's going to be a fall. Okay, I want to move on to welcome then. And I think the word welcome is a positive word, and I think it suggests certainty, that we know what is going to come. And I think this debate really gets at the heart that there's a lot of uncertainty. I think people are very scared. People are very scared of Russia and China and what that could do. But I think what's something we can all agree on is that we don't know what that multipolar world will bring. We don't know post-American fall what will be there. And so maybe welcome isn't really the right word. Maybe we need to change that. And I think that's especially true. Someone brought up democracy earlier, and that democracy kind of is this established thing. And I was thinking to myself, you sound like Francis Fukuyama talking about liberal democracy in the end of history, because we shouldn't take for granted that democracy will just rise above the ashes of American fall. That democracy is still in danger. I mean, for example, India. I don't think an Indian person would say, oh yeah, democracy is just the status quo and we should take it for granted. No, it's under threat, it's in danger. So therefore, this welcome, I think, comes with an entitlement, a certainty. I think we're approaching it as academics, approaching it as if we know, we can understand, but really we don't know what's to come. And I think that's why the wording of the motion is a bit entitled, maybe. Sorry to whoever wrote it. And actually, I think that's a good note to end on. I don't have anything else to say.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the critique. I'm not sure I'll pick you for the floor prize later, but nevertheless, we move back on to the final round of paper speakers. For the final speaker for the proposition, we have Dr. Steven Thrasher. Dr. Steven Thrasher holds the inaugural Daniel Renberg Chair for Social Justice and Reporting at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, and is a faculty member of the Institute of Sexual and Gender Minority Health and Wellbeing. He has worked as a columnist for The Guardian and staff writer at The Village Voice, and published his debut book, The Viral Underclass, The Human Toll When Inequality and Disease Collide, in 2022. You have the ears of the House.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you. A few years ago, I got a doctorate in American Studies so that I could become a professor, but I am at heart a journalist, although one who's currently suspended from the Medill School of Journalism because I spoke about Gaza. We do not have a democracy for people like me to keep our jobs. I am primarily a storyteller, and so I'm going to tell you a story this evening, a story about a student I had in the first college class I ever taught. His name was Andres, and he was the student who taught me how to be a teacher. He was also a total pain in the ass. I'm sorry, I forgot where I was. I should use the proper language. He was a royal pain in the arse. And he taught me a truism that holds for me today. The student who annoys me the most in the beginning of any class eventually becomes my favorite. For even though he made me lose the little hair I had left in 2016, I loved him very much. When I met him, Andres was about 20 years old, around the same age as many of you, considering our motion, and he broke every rule I tried to set down as a new professor. He'd come into class late like a tornado, have no idea what had just been said, interrupt my carefully planned lesson, then open his mouth and say something far more brilliant than anybody had said in the class, including me, and totally elevate the discussion. Andres had been a star debater in high school. God help him if you disagreed with him, he would run you around the room much more loudly than my American countrymen over here in the back of the room. In a way, he was the kind of student you always want to have in a class because he gets students talking to each other critically. And I just had to stand back and make sure the nuclear reaction, which was his mind, didn't blow us all to kingdom come. Less, I would say, than being an American, a phrase which most people have used tonight to refer to people whose citizenship and identity are rooted in the United States of America, Andres was of the Americas, plural. He was, I believe, born in Colombia, a country stripped of its natural resources that for the benefit of US-based corporations like the United Fruit Company, which drove its citizens to migrate north. That's how Andres made it to Texas, a state from which he fled as a queer Latino boy as soon as he could. Andres then made his way to New York University, where he became saddled with a staggering amount of debt. 6 figures worth, which would shape his life forever. He taught me about how many students at NYU engage in sex work. He taught me that even at $500 an hour, the sex work could not keep the debt away. The money from sex work paid for him to go out and socialize with his rich classmates who were, he was gambling, the only pathway to a future job that would allow him to someday pay down his debt. Yes?
Would you not agree that the ability to engage sex work as a university student actually gives you liberty and makes America a great country?
I am, as a sexuality studies scholar, I'm very pro-sex work. I'm pro-sex work, there's no shame in it. However, as I just explained to you, that still did not keep him out of the debt. I remember the day well when Andres really taught me to be a teacher. It was a day late in the term when he was acting out more than usual. I kept him after class. I remember thinking it was like trying to pick up a kitten that was trying to scratch me and hold him by the nape of his neck. In reality, he was picking me up by the nape of my neck and saving my humanity as I entered academia. And I asked him, "What the hell is going on with you today?" And he started to cry. He told me he had recently been diagnosed with HIV, and he hadn't told any adults in his life. The Right Honorable Lord talked about U.S. aid to other countries about AIDS. Black and queer men in the United States, 1 in every 2 of us are projected to become HIV positive in our lifetime. If black gay men were our own country, we would have the highest rate of HIV of any country on earth. Andre told me he had told his boyfriend, who had then dumped him. But worst of all, he was so terrified of using his parents' health insurance plan because they might get a bill or statement that would out him as HIV positive that he wasn't planning to get treatment at all. We don't have an NHS in the United States. About 27 million Americans are uninsured, a staggering number equal to roughly half the population of England. Most Democratic and Republican voters want Medicare for all. Yet even though there's an election in just a few days, neither Donald Trump nor Kamala Harris have any plan at all for universal health care. For someone like Andres, often their best bet is to stay on their parents' insurance until age 26. But this creates very unhealthy power dynamics between parents and their adult children. So imagine those of you who are of this age, instead of going to the NHS, how many of you here are 21, 22, 23, would like it if your parents could take away your health care entirely if they didn't approve of you getting birth control pills, HIV medication, or an abortion? Andres was so terrified of seeking that care that not only it might tip off his parents about his status, but they might cut off his insurance entirely, and he would lose insurance altogether. Fortunately, we were in New York City, which is abundant in AIDS-related services, and I was able to help him navigate that bureaucracy. Still, the programs in New York were focused on people who do not have health insurance, and so I had to work with him on, shall we say, some very creative solutions to get him into care. Yes?
Do you not believe that the decline of America would also lead to the decline in, say, funding public services and living standards, thus making all of these problems worse?
No, because we spend money on the wrong things, as I shall now point out. Andre's health stabilized. He graduated, and part to defer paying back his undergraduate loans, he went to the Miami School of Law, where his debt ballooned from about $150,000 to $300,000. He would storm in and out of my life over the years. We talked on Zoom a lot in early COVID when he was going to law school remotely and living a pretty lonely life. But the last couple times I texted him in 2023, I could see that he had read my iMessages but didn't respond. Then a few months ago, I was suspended from teaching at the Medill School of Journalism because I had protected our students from campus police during their Gaza Solidarity encampment. Because of that, I've heard from pretty much students in every class I've ever taught over the last 8 years, and I would assume that I would hear from Andres sooner or later. But I never heard from him again. Eventually, I learned that Andres died last November. All of his anxiety and worry about the debt and the virus and what was going to become of him finally caught up with him. He would have been 27 years old. My friends, he may have died of a drug overdose like so many young people, but Andres was killed by the United States of America. He was killed by American racism and homophobia that made him feel bad about himself. He was killed by Texas's ban on gay sex education, which helped him become HIV positive in the first place. He was killed by American stigma, shame, and lack of universal health care, which kept him from immediately getting HIV treatment. That killed him. American imperialism stole from his family in Colombia, drove them north, and crushed them in the United States. And finally, the American weight of Andres' student debt pushed him into sex work, which, as I said, there's nothing wrong with on its own, but it did not let him get out of the final crushing weight of the debt that plagued him all the time in his tragically short life. And so I argue to this House, it is obscene that America could not find a place for my beautiful, queer, brown, pain in the arse student who was not really my student at all, but he was my teacher. It is obscene that so that American oligarchs can have tax cuts, Andres had to live with 6 figures of debt just to get an education. It is obscene that we have more unhoused people than any country in the world, and we could house all of them for about $20 billion, and yet just in the last year alone, America spent $20 billion in Gaza, blowing up the houses of families and blowing the intestines out of children and blowing the heads off of journalists and forcing women to go under C-sections without anesthesia before killing their babies and making them fakeless. And I bring up Gaza not just because Andres was passionate about Palestine, but because President Gustavo Petro of Colombia recently laid out how climate change will force even more families to emigrate, like Andres had to. They will be in the billions. And as Petro said, this exodus will be responded to with a lot of violence and barbarism. What we are seeing in Gaza is rehearsal for the future. No, thank you. Humanity cannot survive how the United States plans to keep consuming carbon at the expense of the global South, nor can it survive how America plans to apply what they've learned, torturing Palestinians in the Gaza genocide, towards people forced to migrate on a warming planet. Now, in that class where Andres and I met, we watched a film together about James Baldwin called I Am Not Your Negro. And in that film, there is a scene that is shot in this room in 1965. That was when this House considered one of its most infamous motions. Has the American dream been achieved at the expense of the American Negro? And at this podium, Baldwin spoke as a black gay man of the guilt of being unable to save one's own son or daughter, niece or nephew from being the collateral damage in the creation of the American dream. Like Baldwin, I do not have children myself, but I have nieces and nephews, and I cared very deeply about Andres and dreamed that I would go to his wedding someday, something that will now never happen, although at least I got to bring that fierce debater into this hall tonight. In a parasocial way, I have also come to care about young journalists in Gaza, like Hossam Shabat, a 21-year-old reporter from Jabalia, who is supposed to be a junior in college right now, and instead he spends his days reporting on massacres and mass graves. And so nearly 60 years after Baldwin charged that the American dream came at the expense of the American Negro, I charge in 2024 that America itself exists at the expense of Andres and Hossam, that America exists at the expense of Sudanese cobalt miners and of climate refugees, of the uninsured, of the unhoused, of the more than 1 million people who died of COVID just in the United States, and of the viral underclass. And so it is in Andres' memory and the hope of Hossam's future, and for all of your futures, and for the good of humanity, I say, this House should welcome the decline of America and the American way of life. Don't accept war as a given, as so many people have tonight. Vote for the motion and expand your moral imagination. I rest.
Thank you for that speech. We now move to the final speaker for the opposition this evening, Professor John Mearsheimer. John Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, where he has taught since 1982. He has written extensively about security issues and international politics and published 7 books, including The Tragedy of Great Power Politics and The Israel Lobby in U.S. Foreign Policy, which made the New York Times bestseller list. You have the ears of the House.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for being invited to be here tonight. I think there's no doubt that the United States has declined in recent years simply because we've gone from unipolarity to multipolarity. And in terms of relative power, China and Russia are much more powerful relative to the United States than they were during the unipolar moment. And I take the question on the table to be one of whether or not we should welcome further decline in America's position in the world. And what I'm going to argue here tonight is that it is not in America's interest, it is not in Britain's interest, and it is not in Europe's interest to welcome further decline in American power. Indeed, it was not in our interest to welcome any decline in American power. It would be best from America's point of view and from Europe's point of view, again, to include Britain, if we lived in a unipolar world. Now, I want to make 2 preliminary points before I lay out my argument. First of all, as Michael said in his opening comments, a lot depends on who you're asking whether or not they think American decline is good or bad. As he pointed out, from a Russian point of view, a Chinese point of view, a North Korean point of view, or an Iranian point of view, makes absolutely good sense to welcome American decline. So the argument that I'm making tonight is that from the United States' point of view, Britain's point of view, and Europe's point of view more generally, American decline is not a good thing. Furthermore, I want to make it very clear that I identify with a lot of the criticisms that have been made tonight of the United States. Mary made some of them. I disagree with Mary and my distinguished colleague on this side about the Ukraine war, as you all know. I think we've made a mess in Ukraine. I think we've made a lot of other messes. You and I both agree that what's going on in Gaza is a genocide, and the United States is complicit in that genocide. So I'm not making the argument here that the United States is a noble nation or a virtuous nation that does nothing but good around the world. There's no question that we do some good, for sure. We do some bad as well. And my argument is not one that says we want to keep the United States in the driver's seat. We want to keep it really powerful because it is a virtuous nation. As you would expect from a good realist like me, my argument has a lot more to do with power politics. So let me take the American case first, and then I'll take the European case, and again, focus on the British. Look, we live in a world where there's no higher authority. And in a world where there's no higher authority and some other state may come after you, the best way to survive is to be really powerful. As we used to say when I was a little boy on New York City playgrounds, you want to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block. And you want to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block, not because you want to be able to beat up other states or other people. You want to do that because it's the best way to survive in a system where if you get in trouble, there's no higher authority that you can turn to. So, speaking as an American, I want to make sure that the United States is and remains an especially powerful state, because that is the best way to maximize your security. If you become weak in the international system, you fall prey to other states. Just think about the Chinese. Think about the century of national humiliation from the late 1840s to the late 1940s. The Chinese were weak, And when you're weak, the other great powers prey on you. What's the lesson the Chinese take away from this? What's the reason that the Chinese are my kind of people? The Chinese understand full well they're never going to let that happen again. They want to be the dominant power in Asia, and they certainly do not want the United States to be more powerful than China is. But the fact is, I'm an American, and as an American, I want to make sure we are more powerful than China. I want to make sure we are the most powerful state on the planet. By the way, here's another example. NATO expansion into Eastern Europe. The Russians were adamantly opposed from the very beginning to NATO expansion in Eastern Europe. When Clinton made the decision in 1994, they screamed bloody murder. In 1999, when the first tranche of NATO expansion took place, they screamed bloody murder. What did we do? We shoved it down their throat. Why? They were weak. When the second tranche took place in 2004, they screamed bloody murder. What did we do? We shoved it down their throat. In April 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit, when they said, we do not want Ukraine to become part of NATO, what did we do? We said, we don't care what you think. We're going to shove it down your throat. Why did we do that? Because they were weak. If they were powerful, there would have been no NATO expansion. And the same thing goes with the century of national humiliation. So from an American point of view, and again, I'm an American, I want to make sure the United States is the biggest and baddest dude on the block. And yes, Marriott is sometimes a bad dude, and that's unfortunate. And I've been a critic of a lot of the foolish behavior that we've pursued. But the bottom line is you have to put that aside, and you have to worry above all else about your security, and that means you want to be powerful. That's the Americans. Now, what about the Europeans? What about the British? Why do you want us to be powerful? The answer is very simple. We are committed to remaining in Europe. And as long as we're in Europe, we serve as a pacifier, Ukraine notwithstanding. But for Brits, for West Europeans, and even for East Europeans, having the American military presence in Europe matters enormously. The reason you did not have any conflict in Europe in the unipolar moment, the reason you didn't have any conflict in Western Europe during the Cold War, the reason you don't have any conflict in Europe today is because the Americans are sitting on top of you. In a very important way, the Americans are the night watchmen, and you don't want the Americans to go away. And every European politician understands that very clearly. And the problem that you face, you Europeans in the audience, including you Brits, is Uncle Sugar. You all know Uncle Sugar. Uncle Sugar has a really important threat in East Asia. And there is a powerful incentive for Sugar to pivot to East Asia to deal with China. My view has long been, what in God's name are we doing staying in Europe? There's no real threat in Europe. The Russians are a threat to stability in Europe. They're a threat to conquer Europe. Come on, this is a joke. There is a peer competitor on the planet, and it's East Asia, in East Asia, and we should be pivoting to East Asia, not hanging around in places like Europe and now getting pinned down in the Middle East. So what you Europeans want to understand is that if we get weaker, it's going to be impossible for us to stay in Europe, stay in the Middle East, and pivot to Asia in a meaningful way. We have one major crisis in East Asia, and the incentives for us to get out of Europe and move to East Asia will be very great. You don't want that to happen, and I understand full well, because you understand we're the pacifier. So my bottom line is hope that the United States stays very wealthy and can keep forces in Europe, can keep forces in the Middle East, and then pivot to East Asia.
So do you believe that only Western states deserve to have security?
Do I what?
Do you believe that only Western states deserve to have security?
No, I don't. As I told you before when I started, I think from a Chinese point of view, it is in their interest for America to decline and for China to be the most powerful state on the planet. When I was in Beijing 2 weeks ago, I said constantly that if I were Xi Jinping's national security advisor, I'd tell him that we got to go to great lengths to push the Americans out beyond the first island chain, push them out beyond the second island chain, and then make sure that we, China, are the dominant force in East Asia. We are at least 10 times more powerful than Japan.
We want to dominate Asia. I'm talking as a Chinese national security advisor. We want to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. It's not in China's interest, North Korea's interest, in all the cases that Michael rattled off, to see the United States be number one. But I'm speaking up here as an American and making the case for the United States, for Britain, and for Europe.
Thank you for this speech. I must say it was very refreshing to hear a defense of the United States without any morality.
I would just say to you, when I go to China, one of the reasons I'm very popular in China is that the Chinese say, finally an American who tells the truth and doesn't come over here and talk about their moral virtues.
Some would argue it's also been the European Union which has had a strong role in that. And that leads me to my second point and my actual question, which is, do you think it is not possible to have, at some point in the future, not today, not tomorrow, but maybe in a few decades, a world order where you do not need to be the toughest, baddest guy in the block, and where we can have efficient supranational organizations that can ensure a just order in our nations?
Yeah, with regard to your second question, I think it's impossible to find a way to get into that world. We're in an iron cage where there's going to be security competition among the great powers for as far as the eye can see. And in that world, you want to make sure that the great power that you live in is the most powerful state on the planet, whether it's China or the United States. There's no way out. Your first question had to do, just quickly refresh my memory. Oh, the EU versus NATO. Yeah, I remember when the EU won a Nobel Prize. I was irate. Why did the EU win a Nobel Peace Prize for peace in Europe? It wasn't the EU that produces peace in Europe. I just got done telling you, it's NATO. It's the presence of the United States military. And the reason that the EU has been able to flourish, just one second. The reason that the EU has been able to flourish is because the presence of NATO. You take away the presence of NATO, each of these European states has to provide for its own security because sugar's not up there looking after them. And you will see that economic relations in Europe will deteriorate. And this is why I said, I believe every European politician, including Michael, fully understands that it's imperative to keep the United States here because we are the pacifier.
Okay, thank you very much for everybody that spoke this evening. Just a notice or two before we leave. There is a watch party next week running all the way through till 6 a.m. We've got extended bar license, so drink your way until the early hours of the morning watching those 10,000 voters in Wisconsin. I have to say, the floor speech prize goes to the American gentleman at the back, so see me afterwards. Winter ball tickets are on sale, but they are rapidly selling out. So if you want to get spend an evening there, do try and get your tickets sooner rather than later. But in this house, we vote with our feet. You'll see at the back the eyes, the nose, and in the middle the abstentions. So get up on your feet, walk through the door, and we'll see you in the bar afterwards for our social where we'll announce the results. Thank you, everybody.